Hey guys, welcome to week 6 of Intro to Film. This week we're going to be talking about nonfiction film or documentary film. And we should have a good smattering of films that you can watch. I always get excited for this week. I really like nonfiction film, and I like kind of talking about it. I used to teach a class in documentary history, so I won't try to get too deep on you, but I do want to give you kind of a way to kind of view these films in a different way. I tend to think that when we think about nonfiction film, we typically just kind of think about those boring documentaries we had to watch in a class, something like Helvetica or, the History Channel. But my favorite thing about the medium and the genre is that there's such varied types of stories that can be told through it. So I want to introduce you to some of those different ways that we can tell those stories and kind of give you some more exposure to the different types of films that are out there in terms of documentary. So the first thing I want to talk about is documentary convention. What I mean by a convention is something that's kind of used over and over in a particular division of artwork. So, in documentary, what are those things that we use over and over again? And conventions that I can think of is, things like the interview, B-roll, which is kind of additional footage that you put on top of an interview. We also maybe do recreations. We also may have voiceover narration. When these things are signaled in our videos, we tend to know that that's a documentary starting. If I see an image and I hear a narrator, I know, hey, this program is probably a documentary. And, why do you think that these things developed? Why are documentary films the way that they are? And that's maybe a question that we can kind of get to the bottom of as we're going through some of this stuff. And lastly, what is the goal of a documentary film? And I would say that the goal of a documentary film is to help us understand a particular issue in a new way. Or it could be to tell us a story. Or it could be just to entertain us. And I think there's different documentaries out there that kind of fulfill different requirements. So I may have talked about this film before. It's one of my favorite documentaries. It's directed by two guys named Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, and I'm not a Metallica fan by any means, but thinking about what the goal of this documentary is, initially they went in to do a behind-the-scenes documentary on Metallica as they went to create this album, and really it ended up being kind of a document of this band falling apart, and there's a lot of more interesting developments that came out of the film. So sometimes those goals, when we go to make a film, they can be easily changed when we go on another route. Another good example of that is the film, Capturing the Friedmans, which is kind of about these guys who were accused of sexually abusing these youth in their basement back in the 70s, I believe. And it started out initially as a documentary about a clown. And as they were making the short documentary about a clown, they all of a sudden discovered this new story, decided to pursue it, and I think they ended up winning an Oscar for that film. So it can be interesting where documentaries can take us as we're going along. First question is, what defines a documentary film? And I think, while we say that there are documentary conventions, stepping back and thinking about what a documentary actually is, you can see that there's a lot of kind of gray area between where a documentary begins and where a narrative film is. So, for an example, if I think of a biopic, which I talk about right here, a biopic is a narrative film about a historical figure, then, that's about someone who really existed. It may even contain things that they actually said, but would we call it a documentary? So here's a couple of assumptions that we're working with when we have a documentary. One is that they exist in the same historical world that we live in. So we believe that these events that are happening happened in the same reality that we live in. Okay? Now, you could have something like a fake documentary or a mockumentary. And so a film like this is Spinal Tap, which is a mockumentary. All of those things could exist in the same world, but the fact that they didn't actually exist in our same reality makes that not a documentary film. Another thing that defines a documentary is that it's not fully reenacted. Okay? So a fully reenacted film, if we're just watching someone's life being acted out, we would consider that to be a biopic. Now, you do have documentary films that have portions of it that are reenacted, but if it's not fully reenacted, then we would consider it to be a documentary. So, what's the last biography film that you watched, and would you define this as a documentary? So I'd say, most of the biography films that we watch, or a movie like Lincoln that's coming out, we wouldn't define that as a documentary because the fact that there's acting going on, there's some dramatic elements added into it, the story's kind of manipulated around, even though it may be based on true events. If it's more, experts talking about their life and they maybe have reenactments, we would consider that to be a documentary. Now, there's an interesting film called American Splendor, and it's one of my favorite documentaries, and I feel like it really straddles the line of documentary and narrative film because it calls into this question of representation. How do we represent real figures? So the film is mostly a biopic, but it's narrated by the real person, and it actually has these kind of cut scenes in it where the actors are interacting with the real people. And so it kind of calls into question, this idea of how do we represent these people. And so it just kind of makes a really interesting rebuttal for this idea of, what a documentary really is. What are some common misconceptions about documentaries? This is the list that I made up, and I think, that there are things that we tend to kind of perceive about documentaries that may not be true. So one, documentaries are boring, and I don't think we can say that documentaries are boring because there can be a documentary about any number of topics in our world, and there's probably a documentary out there that is only interesting to you, and it's interesting for that, one thing that you're into. So for me, I really like music documentaries because I really like music, and so that may not be interesting to someone else, but it's definitely interesting to me. And another thing is, documentaries, the storytelling in documentary film can be just as compelling as what we might find in a narrative film. And a great example of that to me is a film that I love called The King of Kong, which you should all check out, which just kind of tells the story of these two guys who are vying for the world championships of Donkey Kong. And the film is a documentary, but there's such compelling stuff in it that, it's hard to believe that it's not like a real feature film. So you should definitely have to check that out. Boom. So the next misconception is that documentaries are or should be objective. So we tend to, news we tend to call objective. And what we mean by being objective is that we're looking from the top down, we're seeing both sides of the issues. And people, have a hard time with filmmakers like Michael Moore because his films are really not objective. And I think Michael Moore is interesting. I don't love his films, and it's not because of any partisan status that I have. I just think he gets kind of into his little thing a little too much. But so they say, well, Michael Moore, we shouldn't listen to him because he's not objective. I was like, well, no film is really objective. Everyone has a certain point of view that they're telling, and we shouldn't expect documentaries to be objective because of those biases. Third misconception, documentaries are easy/cheap to make. And I think that, documentaries are easier to start on our own. They're easier to do by ourselves as a pet project, but they're by no means easier to make. And you might find yourself working for a documentary on 10 years before it ever gets released. Documentaries can be a good place to start, but, I wouldn't say that they're easier to make than a narrative film. A narrative film, you kind of knock it out all at once and you can get it done relatively quickly. So a little bit of doc history. We started back, kind of intersects with film history in a lot of ways. Back in the early 1900s, we have those movie bridge experiments, which we saw. We have the Lumiere brothers who are going out and documenting different cultures. We're doing a lot of films about expeditions and adventure, and that kind of continues in the 1920s and 40s with a film like Nanook of the North, which is one of the most famous early documentaries, and actually is a pretty fantastic film, where it's just kind of documenting this unfamiliar culture to most Americans. Then we kind of start to experiment a little bit. We have films like Berlin, Symphony of a City, Man with a Movie Camera. We start kind of doing kind of this poetic, montage-y type thing, documenting the cities in different ways. We also, during this period, get this idea of propaganda films, that we can use these documentary films to portray information, and information that is really biased to whatever our point of view is. So, especially in the 1940s, they begin to use documentaries as kind of merging with what's happening at news at the time, but as a way of kind of sending out information about a particular cause. In the 1950s to the 70s, we get kind of the cinema verite movement, which the cinema verite movement, that's kind of a term you get thrown around, that gets thrown around a little bit these days, and that's just basically this idea that it's a little bit more free, more handheld, following people around, kind of seeing how they really are. And that is definitely evidenced in the work of the Maysles brothers, who does films like Salesman and Grey Gardens. And also we have a lot of political films that are coming out during this period, like Primary and Harlan County, USA, which are kind of adopting the cinema verite type of feel. And then nowadays, where we are now, definitely I think nowadays we still have a lot of different markets that documentaries are released to. We have kind of more the public television, the television documentaries that we see a lot. We have reality television, which is a form of documentary. We have, theatrical release documentaries, like on the independent side, we're going to Sundance. And then we have kind of these mega documentaries, I like to call them, like films like Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's film, where they're trying to kind of push these really big issues, typically to kind of more liberal audiences. So there's kind of more ways that this content's being distributed, and for that reason, we have people on YouTube, even like little kind of video blog films are documentaries in a way. So for that reason, I think it's really important that we kind of understand this format and understand the history of it. One of the ways that we can look at documentary films is kind of going back to this idea of objectivity versus subjectivity. Well, I guess we haven't really talked about it. I can tend to think of formalism versus realism, but objectivity versus subjectivity. And that is, we can kind of look at what is the relationship between the director of the film and his subject. Is he being more objective? Is it more hands-off, allowing us to kind of make these choices, or is it more subjective where he becomes more a part of the film? And I think that way of analyzing it gives us a little bit of groundwork to work with in trying to define different types of documentary, different approaches to documentaries. So, over on the left-hand side, we have the more objective films. Those are films with less intrusion on the part of the filmmaker in the filmmaking process, and where the audience is left to make judgments on the meaning, arguments, and characters. And then more subjectivity is where there's more intrusion on the part of the filmmaker. They are going as far as creating everything themselves. They're kind of, it's all about them. And the filmmaker is also trying to present a very specific argument. So this guy, Bill Nichols, he came up with these, what are called documentary modes. And these are ways of kind of breaking down documentary and defining them. And they kind of fall along this spectrum of objectivity versus subjectivity. Now, some of them are kind of theoretical and a little bit heady, so I'll try to do my best to explain them. But a lot of time, I don't even kind of understand what they mean by that. But some of these are very, very obvious. So I'll do my best to kind of help you understand the different ways that we can define them. And then you can use that in your screening discussion to define the films that you're watching this week. So the modes of documentary films, as I mentioned before, they were developed by Nichols in 2001. And they're a classification system for how we can define these films. Now, one thing that we should note before I go into defining each of these is that documentary films can kind of straddle or borrow elements from multiple modes. So if you find a film and you feel like it's like a little bit of both, it's probably a good chance that it is a little bit of both. Don't feel like you need to kind of rigidly put them into these different catalogs. So first up is the poetic mode. And the poetic mode is really kind of influence what we would say like is a montage. Okay, so when I think about montage, I'm thinking of just a series of different pictures put to music, and it creates kind of an emotional impact. So films in the poetic mode have a heavy concentration on the power of image and editing. There's not an emphasis on the transfer of information about the historical world, but rather it's really about emotion. So probably the most modern example I can give to you is like a time-lapse film. So a time-lapse is a series of images taken, kind of sped up, placed with music, and it's really kind of delivering kind of an emotional impact, gets you to look at the world in a different way. This is really also influential on music videos because we're combining images and music. We're documenting the world and then replacing it with music to create kind of this emotional experience. So probably one of the most famous films in this genre is a film called Koyaanisqatsi, which has some music by Philip Glass. And what it is, it's just kind of a series of images of modern life composed and placed to music. I will say it's kind of a long film. It's about an hour and a half, and it's supposed to be really poetic and get you to think about kind of your modern existence. I think it's a little hoity-toity, but in terms of what it did for that genre and defining the genre, it's really pretty remarkable in that way. So the cons are films are incredibly abstract and audiences can find it difficult to watch as there's no real storyline in it. So some examples, and these should be clickable if you download the PowerPoint. We have Berlin Symphony of a City, Koyaanisqatsi, Baraka, which is very much like Koyaanisqatsi, and then a more modern example is Star Guitar, which is a music video by the Chemical Brothers. So poetic mode, it's more, it's poetic. It's not really kind of trying to tell us something so much as trying to get us feel a certain way. And you definitely will find, sections of documentary films that have a more poetic tone to it. The next one is the expository mode. And probably the thing that defines the expository mode the most is voice-over narration, okay? Expository mode tries to be it's the most news-like, and it's trying to give us kind of a very objective view of what's going on in a given situation. It relies on voice-over narration as the presentation model. We see B-roll, we have this voice of God narration going over the top, acting really authoritative, telling what's going on. So probably the most common example of this would be like the History Channel, right? We're playing archive footage, we're telling you about what's going on. This is history, these are the people that were involved. Now the problem with this is that there's no real way of kind of vetting what this person says. Sometimes they do bring in experts and do interviews to kind of, help us vet the information. But overall, we might run into a situation like Why We Fight, which is a film made in the 1940s as propaganda for World War II, which was very much relied on this mode. And, there's no way of knowing if that information is really, really true. And a lot of this information was exaggerated a little bit to provoke people to join the war effort. It's more, in terms of the spectrum, it's closer to the objective end of the spectrum, but it can be kind of silently manipulated. So it can become subjective without the audience knowing. There's no way for them to really check that unless they're going out and doing fact checks. The cons can be a little bit overly didactic, meaning that the narrator tells us what to believe, tells us what to know, and we aren't left to do a lot of thinking for ourselves. And it doesn't necessarily account for all the perspectives on a particular event. We often don't hear the other side of the story. So that's expository. The next is observational. And we tend to say that observational is the most objective of the formats. So what the observational film-making movement's kind of rooted in is filmmakers going into situations and simply watching. They would go and take their cameras in, and they just observe these people in these situations. So here are the Maysles brothers, who made many observational films. One of their first films is a film called Salesman, and in which they follow a Bible salesman around. Okay, they're not interacting with him much. They're just kind of following him on his everyday adventures, trying to sell Bibles. And as we observe these situations, we as an audience are left to kind of make judgments and pass judgments on what's going on. Okay, so in that way, it's the more hands-off approach, and it gives more power to the audience. Now, that being said, a problem with it can be a little bit boring. You're not really there's not typically a really strong storyline. A lot of times you don't know what to think. Sometimes you're just thrust into the event. You don't know what's kind of going on around it because there's no narrator or interviews to kind of give you context to what's going on. So I'd say that even though these are the most kind of objective approaches, it's definitely kind of one of the more boring approaches, and you just have to kind of know that going into it. So some examples, there's a film called Don't Look Back, where they followed Bob Dylan around his tour of England. It's a pretty awesome film, but it can be boring at times. And then Salesman, which I mentioned before. And there's a film called Grey Gardens, which is on the screening list for this week, which I think is an awesome film and has actually been really influential in terms of culture and fashion. Next, we have the participatory mode. And this mode really relies on the interaction between the filmmaker and the subject. So in the observational mode, the filmmaker is being really hands-off. He's not really asking questions. In the participatory mode, think of participating. We start to ask questions of our subject. Okay. So in this mode, the filmmaker is interacting with people who are there, interviewing them. He's trying to kind of get an account of what's going on. Okay. Now in this case, we tend to move away from observational because the filmmaker begins to have an influence on what's happening in the story. Okay. Because they're interacting with them, sometimes the filmmaker begins to kind of provoke them in ways that they may not have been provoked in otherwise, and maybe can tend to kind of change the course of the film. So that's kind of a ethical dilemma with these types of films. So Roger and Me, which is Michael Moore's first film, we consider that to be kind of a participatory film. He's interacting with the subject. He's going in and kind of changing the storyline. The whole film is about him trying to interview the head of General Motors about the closing of a factory in his hometown, and basically him getting the runaround from these people. So the cons: excessive faith in witnesses. Are we relying too much on these people that were part of it rather than getting kind of more objective information? And it may be seen as too obtrusive on the part of the filmmaker. They're becoming too much a part of the story. So examples: Roger and Me, and a great film I like called Sherman's March. Okay, we have the reflexive mode, and this is where it kind of gets a little bit theory heavy. I always have a hard time of explaining the reflexive mode, but just know that the reflexive mode is a little bit more self-referential, okay? It's a little bit more aware that it's a documentary, and it's more willing to kind of mix different modes of representation, okay? So it questions the very nature of representation in a documentary film. It uses multiple modes of representation to draw attention to the fact that the film itself is a representation. So saying that word representation a lot. But I feel like even though it's more of a narrative film, that film I mentioned earlier, American Splendor, would be a good example of this reflexive mode, because we have the actors interacting with the real people narrating, and it kind of brings into question this idea of how do we represent. So the cons are it tends to be pretty abstract, and we're losing sight of the content, instead thinking about how we're representing these things. So American Splendor is a good example. Another film is A Thin Blue Line. You probably won't come across this too often, I would say, but we do see occasional examples of that. The performative mode, these are where the main actor kind of acts as the director begins to act as a performer in the film. So these typically are autobiographical, kind of based on the experience of the filmmaker. They often kind of rely on personal experience to kind of give us and address these issues. So this film, as I gave an example, Tarnation, which went to Sundance. The guy made it for like $100, and it actually made it into Sundance, and he got some traction with it. But it's essentially kind of this film about his own struggle with, depression and drug addiction, and he's using that as a landscape to kind of address these really bigger issues. So these tend to also be pretty poetic or avant-garde, and they can also be, tough for audiences to get through because there's not a real strong storyline. But we do see, kind of injections of ourselves as filmmakers into the story, in kind of bigger mainstream documentaries, but they tend to be kind of these smaller, more personal films. All right. So I actually have an additional assignment for this week that I want to talk about. So we have the normal screening, which you're going to watch one of these documentary films, the quiz, and then also the blog post on Burnt Popcorn. But the additional project that I want you to do this week is you are going to submit a proposal for your final project. Now this is fairly easy. Let me just show you what to do. So once you log on to Angel, if you go to the final project proposal, there's a little drop box here. So for your final project, you'll be creating a presentation about a particular director, actor, or other person involved in the filmmaking process. So all you need to do at this point is just give me the name of the person that you want to do your final project about. So essentially what your final project is, you're going to be looking at a particular actor or director or another person involved in filmmaking, and you're going to create a online presentation about that person. Mostly kind of about their history, how they got into the business, and then talk about their signature styles or things that make them stand out as an individual in the world. So all you need to do this week for this assignment is just submit the name of the person that you want to do. If you're having a hard time kind of choosing, you can do a couple. But I do want to make sure that kind of not everybody in the class is doing the same thing, just so we can kind of get some different viewpoints. So that's your additional activity this week. And let me know if you have any questions about it. And then the other activities should be pretty self-explanatory. They're the same as what we've done before. So I hope you guys enjoy looking at some documentaries this week. Hope it expose you to some new stuff that you may not have seen before. And have a good week, and I will catch you later.